Hello, so I'm going to try and make this video as concise as possible, because I know that some of mine are sort of like just a way of attempting to figure out ideas, so perhaps they can meander a little bit and go down a lot of tangents. And I can't promise that that won't happen in this video, because sometimes it just happens. I just let my thoughts go where they want to go. And you might be sick of this already if you've been keeping up with my videos recently, but this is going to be another one on Wittgenstein, and it's going to be related to my essay. So I'm just going to describe the different components, the key components of Wittgenstein's ideas that are relevant to the essay specifically, and maybe some other ideas as well, but I'll try not to go on too many tangents. If that happens, then it happens, but it's not my initial intention for that to happen. So the essay question is, I don't actually have it in front of me at the minute, but I think I can remember it. Where one cannot speak, one must remain silent. How should this statement be understood? And then we have to discuss the distinction made by Wittgenstein about what can be shown and what can be said. So where one cannot speak, one must remain silent is essentially like an assertion or a maxim or just a statement. I'm not sure exactly about the language we'd use to describe that, but I'm going to say it's a statement anyway, because that's what's implied within the following questions. That's probably the safest route to go. But I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, right? Wherever one cannot speak, one must remain silent. It's almost like tautological in some ways. If someone can't speak, then logically they must not be making any sounds. And the definition of not making any sounds is being silent. Okay, so that's a perfectly rational thing to say. It's perfectly logical. But then the things that we have to discuss from that is, what exactly can't we speak about? What's stopping us from being able to speak about certain things? And there I think Wittgenstein would say, it's not that we can't speak because we're being tied up and we've got a rope around our mouth which is preventing us from making sound. Rather, there are logical restrictions on language. Or language, the purpose of language is to state logical facts. Okay? So, and what Wittgenstein means by facts is not necessarily facts in the sense that we might think of facts. Okay, rather we've got to really break this down. So, Wittgenstein makes facts synonymous with objects. Okay, so, and it's not just singular objects, it's not just singular things, rather it's things and objects in relation to one another in the world, because everything that exists does not merely exist as a list of things, it doesn't exist as a catalogue. Rather, things necessarily exist in relation to one another in the world. And the things in relation to one another in the world make up a state of affairs. And the state of affairs is a fact, okay? So, in a room, for example, you may have a sofa, you may have another sofa which is perpendicular to the initial sofa. You may have a door which is parallel to the side of the other sofa, which is slightly to the right of a window, for instance. And everything within the state of affairs is essentially a fact. It's not so clear. Well, supposedly we could describe that in an extremely mathematical way. We could break down the world and we could use measurements in order to be able to give an extremely accurate picture of what actually exists. And that would be a fact. It doesn't seem to be the case that in everyday life we encounter this sort of mathematical approach to the world, because we're just not equipped to do that. Okay, so we look at the world in perhaps a more simple way, almost a dumbed down way to how it actually is, just because of the amount of mental comprehension it would take to be able to figure out the exact relation of objects within a particular state of affairs. Okay, it just wouldn't be practical at all. And obviously we have lives, we have things that we need to get on with, so that's not necessarily the purpose of life, but that is for Wittgenstein the purpose of language. It's describing states of affairs, it's describing facts. Okay, so, and I guess linking to this dumbed down version of things, we can look at pictures. Okay, and Wittgenstein has a picture theory of language, and when you think of a picture, you think of a representation of something. It's not just a picture, it's always a picture of something. Okay, so for instance, we've got the picture of the Mona Lisa, and the Mona Lisa is a painting or a representation of a woman. Okay, so the painting itself is very different from the reality. So it's made out of different materials. It's two-dimensional. It's possibly got different colours. And it's in a frame. It doesn't age. It sits on a wall in a museum, unlike the actual woman who was in the painting, who is now probably dead and in the ground. But nonetheless, there are still similarities between the representation and the reality. So, and it's these things which are identical between the picture and the reality, which represents the pictorial form. Okay, so, or the logical form, right? So the pictorial form is the way in which the picture is composed, and the pictorial form has a particular logical form which is coherent with the logical form of reality, which causes the representation of the picture, which is perhaps much more simplistic, to be a representation of an actual thing within reality. And I guess you could say, in some ways, that the picture is a way of us understanding the world in a much more simpler way. And that's just me speculating there. But we can take that if we use a different example. So within science and within mathematics, oftentimes we will use diagrams to explain particular phenomena, to explain particular facts in the world. And the diagram is a pictorial representation of something which exists. And the thing with the diagram is that it does have particular symbols present within it. It has a particular form which represents the reality. It's coherent and adequate to the actual reality. So the picture I'm thinking of at the minute is when you have, say, a representation of an electrical circuit where you have the amps and the volts, and you have the lines which represent the wires. Now, when you're given that, you're able to somehow tie it to the reality and learn about the actual reality from the picture. And again, obviously, there was someone who first had to derive the picture from the actual reality and put it onto the paper. And I think that tells us something very interesting about human nature, but I'm not sure that's what Wittgenstein was interested in. I don't think that was what Wittgenstein was interested in, at least in his early work. Okay, so we have the picture theory of language, right? And what I said was that there is a pictorial form or a logical form which is represented within the picture and the reality, okay? But it's not that the picture shows us or is intended to represent a pictorial form or a logical form. Rather, that is just something that we derive from it, okay? That we have to be shown. We can't be told about the pictorial form. The picture or the symbol cannot represent pictorial form. Rather, it can embody it. Pictorial form or logical form is manifest within a picture. It's manifest within a reality. Okay, it's not something that is separate to it. It's not something we can abstract from it. Okay, we merely see that something has logical form if it is coherent with some form of reality, some form of conceivable reality. And this whole idea of conceivable reality, I think, is important as well. Because when we conceive of something, we may picture it in our minds. And as far as I'm aware, Wittgenstein also said that the pictures can be sort of mental images. Now, he seems to have two ideas of pictures. Pictures as actual facts and pictures as something that exists in our mind. This is what I've taken from the Tractatus anyway. And the whole idea of pictures existing in our minds is that we can picture possible states of affairs. So for instance, and that's based on the concepts that we have. Okay, so say if I was to utter a proposition, like the dog is on the table. I know what a dog looks like, I know what a table looks like. Therefore, I can picture in my mind that that statement is possible. Okay, it's not just about the dog on the table as well, by the way, it's about the dog being on the table. That's important too. So the dog implies singular dog, it implies a being, which does exist. The table, also, it's the word the, which is interesting there as well, which implies a particular table that we can imagine the dog being on top of, so with the word on. And it's the logical form, or the way in which the proposition is formed, which gives us information, a pictorial representation within our minds about what is actually happening in the reality. So you could have a dog on a table, but then you could have the dog is underneath the table. A dog is underneath a table. Okay, and all of these things are the different representations of the same objects. They're different ways of the same objects making manifest in the world. Okay, so a dog being under a table is not very specific. When you say a, it almost implies any. When you say the, it implies specific. Like, so the particular dog is under the table. Presumably, if you were saying that, you would be saying that to someone who would know what particular dog you were talking about. Otherwise, your statement would seem to lack meaning. Okay? Or, like I'm doing right now, I'm using it as a particular example. You don't know what dog I'm talking about. You know that I'm using this hypothetically as a way of representing what I mean, or what Wittgenstein means, perhaps, or what I mean, or how I understand what Wittgenstein means, at least. Okay, so that's something I thought of recently. So the distinction, right? So then let's take a different kind of concept, something that exists differently, or doesn't exist at all, debatably. And I think I've talked about this example before, but we've got the number 7, right? So let's say 7 is under the table, right? That's not the same statement as the dog is under the table, because you can't describe 7 in that sort of way. And I've tried to think about why, because it seems to have the same form, it seems to have the same logical structure that makes up the statement. So why can't it be manifest within reality? And the truth is, it could be manifest within reality if we were to substitute the meaning of the word 7. Okay, because the word 7 is distinct from 7 itself, and it's debatable as to whether 7 actually exists, but we could always attribute 7 to something else. For example, we could call the dog 7, and that way it would depend on the context. If you knew the dog was called 7, therefore I say 7 is under the table, you know that I'm talking about the dog. You wouldn't assume I was talking about a number 7. Okay, but the 7 is under the table is a statement that doesn't make sense. Okay, it's not a singular thing, right? We can't apply a 7, we can't apply the 7. We can say the number 7 is under the table, but then it's like, then we're specifying that it is a number, and we know that a number does not have material reality outside of it being manifested within certain things. Okay, so we know that doesn't make sense. So to say the 7 is under the table doesn't make sense. To say 7 is under the table doesn't make sense, because it doesn't specify using the word the or the word a. Whether or not we're talking about a singular 7, which wouldn't make sense, or a multiple 7, which wouldn't make sense. Therefore, because we can't picture it, it doesn't have sense. The proposition is senseless. It's not something that can be manifest within reality. Therefore, that proposition would probably be meaningless, and it's one of the places where we ought to remain silent. And other places where we ought to remain silent include talking about ethics and values, because these things also don't have manifestation within material reality, rather they're judgments we place upon things, debatably. And yeah, so these things also aren't subject to language, which is perhaps a flaw with Wittgenstein because we do talk about these things. And also, I talked about Kierkegaard as well, in some ways, because he's rather like an irrational writer, or he actually advocates going beyond the rational or the reasonable by suspending the teleological, which also doesn't. Then again, I'm going to cut out very soon, but Kierkegaard did say we shouldn't talk about that because it's irrational. Okay, so that's actually quite a good advancement. Anyway, I'm going to go. Thank you for watching.